Okay, so you guys asked for it. You want to know more about your ego. So when we talk about ego, we cannot ignore arguably the grandfather of psychology, Sigmund Freud. So he came up with the idea that as humans we have the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is our animalistic, our basic desires. They're kind of the things where we want to react impulsively without really thinking things through. Then we have the superego, that's kind of our moralistic, our kind of probably the angel on your shoulder, so to speak. And then you have the ego, which the ego's job is the I. The ego is you. The ego is that balance between the id and the superego. So for example, if you get cut up in traffic, your id really wants you to chase after them, shout at them, scream at them. But then you've got the superego being, let it go, it's fine, it doesn't matter. And then you've got the ego is kind of trying to balance out between the two of chasing after them or completely letting it go. And sometimes it's about kind of being in tune of which area you're in tune with. But sometimes it is really the ego's job to really balance that for you. And the thing with the ego is based in both your unconscious and your consciousness, whereas the id is mainly in your unconsciousness. And with that, sometimes the ego obviously shows up when we don't really expect it. It's kind of that reaction to certain things. And often you hear people say, well, that's my ego reacting. And when we look at children, when we are a child, we're quite egocentric because the world simply revolves around you. So that's what we have learned to deal with, really, that everyone pays attention to us because we are the center. And then as we get older, we develop that perspective taking, so we're able to then allow that ego to become more in balance. Some people, depending on their childhood, they don't actually become the center. So sometimes within that, the id becomes more developed. So those real basic needs are more developed, and that really kind of goes into our childhood, and that's possibly a whole other video. But really the idea with our ego is to be aware when it shows up. If we want to do any work on our ego, it is something that can take a long time because it's something that has been possibly in our unconscious for all of our life, and it's about bringing it into our consciousness. It's about being aware of the things where our ego shows up. And with our ego, it is a very rigid part of our identity, and some people explain the ego as our personality in general. So really, with that in mind, it's about asking ourselves, how do I talk about myself? In what situations do I talk about myself? And then thinking about what adjectives do I use to describe ourselves? Do I call myself happy? Do I call myself stubborn? And all of those form really part of your ego as part of who you are. And then also it's the other end of it that the ego is the balancing act. The ego tells us really what is not part of us. So those situations where we feel uncomfortable is possibly where our ego is coming out the most. So when we come out of a situation, really noticing what was it about that situation that made me feel uncomfortable, what part of it reacted. And some psychologists say to do with the gut instinct, that is really our ego trying to talk to us when we feel uncomfortable or when we react in a certain way. And really being aware of where our ego shows up is a really key thing for us to be aware of. And when we think of our ego, as I said, it's the identity that we've created for ourselves. And if anything shows up that is outside of that identity, sometimes it creates a feeling of discomfort, I suppose. And really that is because it's outside of our identity. Or if anyone describes us in a different way, how we don't describe ourselves, if it is not something that our ego wants to accept, we can react really strongly like, I don't behave like that, or that's not me. And that's because it's really, really clashing with what our ego, that identity that we've created for ourselves. And I think I'd like to give an example of something that, if we are in an argument with someone, and it's someone that we really don't want to be in an argument with, sometimes we have this argument that we want to really do something to lessen the discomfort of this argument, but there's something that's stopping us. Something that's stopping us from apologizing or moving forward, and that is generally our ego, because we don't want to be seen as potentially, we may see that if we apologize that we're being submissive or we're letting the other person get away with it. And that is when the ego is saying, like, no, you don't have to apologize for that. You don't have to change anything, because it is threatening that identity that we've created for ourselves. However, if we are aware of that reaction, then we're able to work through it. That being okay to do things that are outside of identity doesn't mean that we're less of a person. It means we're in that developmental stage, that we have an awareness of who we are as a person, who we want to be, and we're willing to take that vulnerability, because the ego doesn't want to feel vulnerable. The ego is that part of us that we have created, that we feel satisfied with, we are happy with, and anything outside of that can make us feel quite vulnerable. So that's why we don't want to change it. So that is really just a bit about our ego and how it can really show up for us. I'm going to do a part 2 for some exercises on how you can play around with your ego and ways that you can really understand it more. But I just wanted to give this background into really where it comes from and how it can show up.